Okay, let's get started because we have a busy day ahead of us. Okay, welcome everyone to the second session of the Oxford University China-Africa Network Conference for 2021. I would like to welcome everyone to what should be a fascinating discussion on the role of geopolitics in influencing the pandemic response in Africa and health competition. My name is Nicholas Lipolis, and I'm a doctoral candidate in politics at the University of Oxford. Together with my colleague Harry Verhoeven, I convene OCAN. Just to give you some background, this is the second session of our conference, which started earlier today with a keynote, which gave an general overview of the implications of a great power competition for Africa. We feature Professors Odarne Vestad and Christopher Clapham. They looked at the issue from various perspectives: ideological, political, economic, cultural, military, and so forth. In this session, we'll focus more squarely on the health dimensions of great power competitions and look at how geopolitics impinges on health responses to so-called vaccine diplomacy, but also many other aspects of health and public health in Africa. So just to get us started, let me introduce our chair. We're delighted to have Professor Simukai Chigudu chairing our event today. Simukai is an associate professor of African politics at the Oxford Department of International Development and a fellow of St. Anthony's College. He's a qualified medical doctor whose interests span the social politics of inequality in Africa, public and global health, among other topics. He's the author of The Political Life of an Epidemic, Cholera, Crisis and Citizenship in Zimbabwe, which is a study of the social and political causes and consequences of Zimbabwe's catastrophic cholera outbreak in 2008-2009. He actually just comes from presenting his book at an earlier talk, so we appreciate he's very busy. We appreciate having him here today. We're very lucky to have him and an esteemed team of panelists. So let me just hand over to Simukai, who will do the rest of the introductions and for all the speakers. Simukai, to you.
Great, thanks so much, Nicholas and Harry. And the only other thing I would add to my biography is that when I was in Nicholas's shoes as a doctoral student, I co-convened UCAN and had been really trying to push a global health agenda into how we understand the kind of geopolitics of China's involvement in Africa. So it's timely and unfortunate, though, about the circumstances that have really foregrounded this agenda is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been wreaking devastation in our world now for well over a year. And about this time last year, a bit earlier, the conventional wisdom about how COVID-19 was going to unfold was that it was going to arrive on the African continent as a kind of unmitigated catastrophe. By all accounts, in scientific journalism, policy predictions, and indeed amongst many scholars, there was great anxiety about the African continent's capabilities by way of health systems to respond to the epidemic, and also economically to be able to absorb the kind of shocks that would come in from public health measures such as lockdowns to kind of flatten the curve of hospital admissions and of the epidemic. Yet, as we've seen, it hasn't played out exactly like that. An array of various factors ranging from demography to geography, African political agency, as well as communal responses to the outbreak have lent a really complicated picture about quite how this pandemic has unfolded on the ground. And yet we now see a different version of almost the same story occurring a year later, wherein the global race toward vaccines has once again placed Africa at the back of the queue as a kind of final frontier in all the worst ways for how we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The distribution of vaccines, no doubt, is a global challenge worldwide. And Africa has been markedly absent from many of the major deals around vaccine provision, suffering from questions of underfunding and under-resourced health systems. This, again, is a long-standing story around access to therapeutics and other medicines in Africa, as we've learned from previous experiences like the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So this session is about trying to lay out the complexities of these different facets of the outbreak and really start to dig a little bit deeper into the actual geopolitical narrative around vaccine diplomacy and health competition. Does China represent a threat or an opportunity for the continent? And how does that sit within a shifting alignment of various polarities within the distribution of power in the international system? We're extremely lucky to have a really distinguished group of panelists. I guess there's one thing that the pandemic does allow for is the opportunity to draw in some of the leading thinkers on the front line of these kinds of questions in different parts of the world. So it's really my great pleasure to introduce to you our panelists. We have Emmanuel Balogun, a political scientist who works on Africa's role in international affairs and regional institutions. He is a professor at Skidmore College and a regular contributor to the Monkey Cage blog on the Washington Post. Joining him in California is Dionne, the author of Doomed Interventions, The Failure of Global Responses to AIDS in Africa, a really stunning book that actually gave me a lot of inspiration for my own work. And Kim works on the popular politics of health and has also served as a Fulbright scholar in Malawi. And she's an associate professor at the University of California in Riverside. We have Joshua Eisenman, established scholar on the political economy of China's development and its relations with other countries in the developing world and the global south. Joshua is a prominent member of Notre Dame's faculty in the School of Global Affairs and has previously been a visiting scholar at Fudan University, Peking University, and New York University in Shanghai. In Texas, we're joined by Gordon Shen, an assistant professor at the Health Science Center at the University of Texas in Houston. Gordon has advised the World Health Organization and the World Bank in the recent past and received his PhD also from California, but in Berkeley. And he's a leading global public health specialist, widely published in a range of top journals. And I'm expecting that we will be joined from South Africa by Mandisa Mbali, a historian trained at Oxford, but currently teaching at the University of Cape Town. She has written on South African AIDS activism and global health politics. Okay, so this is our lineup. I think we'll proceed in the order that I've introduced everyone. Our speakers have about 5 to 10 minutes to give a presentation. After that, we will transition into a discussion with our many guests. If you do have questions during the sessions, feel free to enter them into the chat, and I will be collating them as we go along and distributing them to our panelists as appropriate. Okay, so Emmanuel, let's begin with you.
Right, great. Thank you for the invitation to speak here, and thanks for the introduction, Simukai. It's great to be amongst some people I really respect and inspired by in their work as well. So I'll talk. So our discussion today is going to be a lot about sort of the great power competition between China and the U.S. However, as it relates to COVID-19, I'd like to focus a lot of my comments on the actual, the agency of African actors. And so, Simukai, you in your remarks to start talked a little bit about why that initial narrative of devastation on Africa did not play out in the way we, most in the scientific community expected. And one of the sort of vantage points that I'm coming at this from is to think about what role actual African actors and African leaders play and played in the pandemic response, and how they are able to assert their preferences and strategies in terms of who they choose to align with in response to COVID-19. So I'll discuss this in 3 areas. I'll talk about Africa's preference for multilateralism in the initial stages of its COVID response. And I'm talking about Africa when I talk about multilateralism. I'll mainly be talking about the African Union. I'll talk briefly about access to vaccines, and particularly the reliance on COVAX, and then the relationship between China and Africa and the diplomatic implications on great power politics. So starting with the multilateral response. And so again, at the initial stages of the pandemic, when the World Health Organization deemed COVID to be a public health emergency of international concern, a lot of what we saw was countries such as the United States, countries in Europe, looking inward to develop their responses. So we see lots of restrictions on travel, and who's coming in and out and things of that nature. And so while that was a response most countries adopted, at the early stages, we saw a different direction happening in the continent of Africa, mainly through the African Union pushing what they called a harmonized response to the pandemic. And why they chose to harmonize their response is, one, they thought that they could rely on their own technical capacity, thinking about the African Union and scaling up its Africa CDC, its ability to develop public-private partnerships, and rely on established existing relationships with international donors and health institutions as well. And so there are a number of areas in which that multilateral response developed. The one I'll focus on here, I'll just talk briefly about, is the African Medical Supply Platform, which I think is a good example of the African Union's public-private partnership dynamics. And so this was developed through a special envoy, African Union special envoy, Strive Masayua, who is an African entrepreneur and very wealthy man. But he, in collaboration with Gavi, with the World Health Organization, and the Africa CDC, developed this platform where African countries could, is a central platform where African countries could have access to medical supplies, testing equipment, medical equipment, and then eventually vaccines. And so this was a sort of a targeted action by the African Union, to harmonize its response, but also to streamline equitable access across the continent. Another key actor in the multilateral response is the Africa CDC director, John Nkengasong, who was a vital leader, who has been a vital leader and on the front lines advocating for a common African position in global health, particularly in establishing partnerships with the World Health Organization, also being a political advocate in terms of vaccine equity across the world, but also early on in the pandemic, making sure that African countries had access to testing and other PPE. Other actors of note would be the Jack Ma Foundation, the MasterCard Foundation as well, and then also the African Union developing a joint continental strategy, which would create a clinical community of practice to provide knowledge, to serve as a knowledge hub to develop best practices for African health workers, and provide risk communication strategies and things of that nature. So embedded in this multilateral response, or sort of the aftermath of this multilateral response, is now this scramble for vaccines, which I'm sure others will talk in more detail about. And right now is particularly an inflection point on what this is going to mean for Africa, but particularly because while there have been millions of vaccines distributed across the continent, we're now seeing countries have to destroy vaccines because of either vaccines hesitancy or definitely because of expirations, right? But within even the distribution of vaccines on the continent, China has been shown itself to be a reliable partner to African governments in the distribution and provision of vaccines. So according to a report from the Bridge Consulting Group, 30 African countries have received vaccines through sales or donations from China, and the deals between China and African governments have been increasing. We also have seen recently that Egypt is going to be the first African country to manufacture the Sinovac vaccine starting in June. And China has also announced its desire to bring more vaccine manufacturing to the continent as well. This also echoes a lot of what the World Health Organization has done in terms of approving the Sinopharm vaccine that could also work to offset the challenges African governments have faced receiving European and US produced vaccines. And so where this is also important is that prior to the creation and the dissemination of vaccines, African health officials played a crucial role in the World Health Organization's accelerator program to accelerate the development of tests, treatments, and vaccines. Yet, despite the heavy hand that African health officials have played in fast tracking things like COVAX, the African countries combined have only received about 2% of the world's available vaccines. And then also we're seeing difficulty in terms of the dissemination of vaccines through COVAX, mainly because of vaccine export shutdowns in India. And then also a lack, again, of the international community putting in resources to support COVAX. So about 42 countries in Africa are depending on COVAX for their vaccine provision, and it's grossly underfunded and under-resourced. And so the last thing I'll talk about is how this all ties in together with the theme of this panel, and mainly to talk about the relationship that China has been cultivating with African countries and the African Union. And so China and the African Union have been relying on multilateralism and global governance to shape their relationship on the continent, particularly in China's diplomacy with African countries around health and other areas too, such as peace and security and climate change. It's all been framed around this idea of mutual support and mutual trust and friendship, and this idea that China is a long-term development partner and a partner in safeguarding independence and sovereignty with African governments. So, for example, President Xi last week had a call with President Tshisekedi of the DRC in stressing this need for deepening cooperation in the fields of public health and peace and security and climate change, and encouraged that the DRC partner with China to pursue UN sustainable development. And whereas in response, Tshisekedi also thanked China for providing vaccines and supplies to fight the pandemic. So there's this narrative of mutual solidarity and support that often undergirds the relationship between China and its partners on the continent. And so one could look at what China is doing in Africa and thinking about this, how it's strategically using the United Nations and its own relationships through FOCAC with the African Union to stress coordination around health. Particularly, we can see an example of this week where the Minister of Foreign Affairs helped chair a UN Security Council open debate on peace and security and pandemic and post-pandemic responses on the continent. And so China's really been trying to assert itself in using multilateralism in that regard. But also to look at, again, from the other side of the preferences of African leaders, and that we see through China's engagement with Africa, that there's a growing sentiment and a growing desire for African leaders to align with or to engage with China over more traditional actors. And this aligns with Dr. Folashade Sule's work, that highlights the differences of where African leaders choose to engage at lower numbers or increasingly lower numbers with the US and the UK, and are more interested in engaging with Russia and China and preferring them as development partners as well. And this is also a stark contrast to how countries like the United States have positioned their foreign policy towards Africa here, particularly in the United States, where the previous administration oriented its approach to Africa purely in competition to China, where the current Biden administration has signaled a re-engagement with multilateralism. It's unsure how that is going to play out in terms of its relationship with Africa, particularly in the response to global health. And so I want to just conclude on 2 points, two sort of questions that I've been pondering as I've been thinking about what the implications are for great power politics in China's interactions with African governments. And so the first question that I'm pondering is, from my vantage point, there's a tendency to look at what China's doing on the continent purely through this sort of grand strategic framework. But I think, for me, the question I'm asking, if that is such a sort of a pervasive attitude that China is bringing to the continent, why do African leaders then opt to look towards China to facilitate its collective response? I would argue that there's a disconnect in the assumed narrative that China is there to purely only for the questions of self-interest and material gain engage in Africa. And that it also takes away the actual desire for African leaders to prefer China as a development partner rather than the United States. And then additionally, one thing that has been glaring throughout the scope of the pandemic is the absence of the West in the technical response, in the sense that this ought to have been an opportunity for the United States and China to align and collaborate as they have in other global public health outbreaks to provide a coordinated strategy to respond to COVID-19. And that was absent. So how can we then think about sort of that absence of cooperation and then the existing divide of the vaccine gap that we're seeing in the world, and how this can stop potential collaboration between the United States and China can work to prevent COVID from becoming a poor disease, or a disease that only affects those who are the have-nots in the world. So these are sort of the bigger questions that I hope that we can engage in the discussion in question and answer. And I look forward to hearing my colleagues' takes on this as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Oh, sorry, Simukai, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was just briefly going to remind remind our guests to feel free to type questions away either in the chat or in Q&A. I'm keeping track of everything before we transition to discussion. Sorry, Kim, over to you.
See, these are the things, like I try to be quick to like save us time, and then anyways, so I'm so grateful to follow Emmanuel. For those of you who didn't hear the news, he was actually sharing something that just came out today, and I've put a link in the chat to the AP story about China saying that it was going to provide vaccines to almost 40 African nations. I don't know what almost 40 is. Like, is there one that's like a nation and a half? I don't know. But it's interesting, right? That this news is really exciting and interesting, and coming at a time right after the U.S. has, finally said that they're going to donate some of their unused doses to COVAX, which would then be distributed to many African countries. So for those of you who hadn't seen the news and wanted to know more about what Emmanuel is talking about, there's the link for you. So my remarks today are really to make 3 reading recommendations. So I'm going to go through 3 things that I've read recently that I think all of us should be familiar with and reading and thinking about some of these issues. And I hope by the end of what I have to say, the one thing that I hope people will get from this is that it's going to boil down to trust. So if there's anything I've learned in my study of pandemics, but specifically my study of this pandemic, the thing that really matters is trust. Trust in government, trust in vaccines, right? That is going to determine not just how citizens and ordinary folks take on health promoting behaviors, which is important for all of us who are trying to live through this pandemic, right? We want people to take on health promoting behaviors so that all of us can stay healthy and fewer of us can get infected and get sick and die. That's important. But I also think just from like a political perspective, trust is going to matter for whether certain political actors can claim credit and to call on that credit that they're claiming. So, and I've also just I'm going to copy and paste the 3 reading recommendations into the chat now as well, so that folks have them at the ready. The first one I want to talk about is Tanisha Fazal's article in the special issue of International Organization. And this article is really important, and I think you could see some of the major themes, right, coming through in Emmanuel's remarks. And so this article, Health Diplomacy in Pandemical Times, it makes us think about like what is the purpose of health diplomacy, right? And there's really 2 aims. So one is like this actual aim to shore up global health. We want the world to be healthier. And whether that's because we care about other people in the world or we just care about our own health, as long as everyone else stays healthy, that increases the likelihood that we'll stay healthy. So, whether it's an altruistic or an individualistic reason for global health, right? That one of the aims of health diplomacy is to actually improve global health. and the other aim is serving a national interest, right? And I think that that's kind of what we're trying to talk about in this panel, right? Is what are the interests, for example, of a couple of great powers, the United States and China, and what's interesting is it's really hard for us, even as analysts who've been trying to look at this for a long time. It's hard for us to clearly disentangle the two, right? Because that's getting into the great powers' intentions. Like, do they intend for health promotion, or do they intend just to be able to claim credit or call a favor because they can say that we did this thing for you, now it's your turn to do this thing for us. And I looked in particular at, as Simukai mentioned, I was a Fulbright Fellow in Malawi, and my book, Cambridge picked the title, so they put Africa in the title, but really it's so much of the book draws on the Malawian experience. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is Malawi, and if you didn't know about this tiny sliver of a landlocked country in southern Africa, well, it's the only place that's like moving forward on the democratic scale. So it's the place you should be knowing more about. So you're welcome. Here's your little lesson on Malawi today. So Malawi has received vaccines through COVAX, right? So this kind of multilateral, multi-institutional organization that's coordinating supply of vaccines, not just to poor countries, right, but to anywhere that needs them, because perhaps they don't manufacture them. And so Malawi, received its first shipment of COVAX in early March, right? And these places that are destroying expired vaccines that Emmanuel Balogun just talked about, Malawi is one of them. It was in the news this week because it had destroyed 20,000 vaccines. In fact, they made a whole big public spectacle of it. The Minister of Health showed up, and so I take this example to say, Malawi is getting vaccines through COVAX. The United States is contributing vaccines to COVAX. So the United States is using multilateralism, right, to provide vaccines. But at the same time, the United States is doing work bilaterally for which it's easier for the United States to claim credit. So in this case, in addition to saying like, oh, we're giving vaccines to COVAX, COVAX will decide who needs them, and when, and it's going to get, to the most countries and the most people in need, so there's this kind of magnanimous, we're doing this thing for global health, right? But when it comes to national interest, they can also say, USAID just announced a month or two ago that USAID Malawi just announced a $3.5 million commitment to providing the things necessary for vaccines. So it's not just doses you need, right? And of course, the COVAX facility has delivered doses, syringes, and then syringe safety boxes, right, for after they've been used so they can be safely disposed. But you need other things like paying healthcare workers to go out and put those shots in arms, and paying for the fuel to drive the healthcare workers out into the rural areas to do that, providing for civic education campaigns so that people can learn more about it. And so so the United States government doesn't just have to rely on multilateral institutions to promote global health, but it can also engage in these kind of bilateral activities like, having this big event where you get to stand next to the Minister of Health and say you're giving them $3.5 million and have a photo op in the local newspaper. And so read Tanisha Fazal's article to think about, how health diplomacy works. But then read, and he didn't mention this article of his, Emmanuel has written, is fresh off the press, paper with Amy Patterson, another great scholar of global health governance, that was published in African Studies Review, that draws on both of their decades of work on African agency, and how, Africa is not a place to which great powers can just meddle and involve themselves. I know that, colonialism happened, and that frames a lot of how we think about the continent, but what's really imperative about Amy and Emmanuel's work is making us rethink some of these tired, frames that we have about thinking about diplomacy on the continent. And I think that in particular, what I like about their work is how they show in this article, but in their books and other articles more broadly, they show how African actors can manipulate global connections for their own political purposes. So it's particularly fortuitous for African leaders who maybe are facing other political challenges to be able to play great powers off of each other, right? And if there's anything we know from studying Cold War in Africa, like this does not bode well for democracy. This does not bode well for accountability of political leaders, because they don't have to be held accountable to their citizens if they're able to get resources and power from abroad. And then so read their work. The last thing I want to share is Lena Ben Abdullah's great book, Shaping the Future of Power, which was just published last year by University of Michigan Press. This book has really changed the way I think about not just international relations as it pertains to Africa, but international relations more broadly, and about how she shows us of not just these like what the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Like it's not just about these huge bridges and trains, and it's also these people to people connections, and that's going to have a really important influence on how Africans think about China and how Africans think about the United States. I mean, that's why the U.S. has had the Peace Corps for how long, operating in how many African countries, right? But what's interesting is the role that social media is playing in this, right? So you don't have to be person to person and interacting with a person from China in Malawi. You don't need to interact with them in real life because you have WhatsApp. You have other ways of seeing and connecting to other people. And I bring in WhatsApp and this connection because I think this is where we're going to really need to focus our energy and attention, because WhatsApp, while it and other social media platforms enable us to disseminate information, they also disseminate misinformation and disinformation, and it's the kinds of stories that are proliferating on WhatsApp are part of the reason why we're seeing, for example, a hesitancy among some populations in Malawi to get vaccinated. And that's not peculiar to Malawi, of course, but I think that if we think about, for example, some of the racist events that occurred in China towards Africans, right? In Guangzhou, after 5 Nigerians tested positive for COVID, there was significant backlash against the large African migrant community in Guangzhou, and that traveled on WhatsApp. And you can be on the continent not having ever gone to China, and you see that, and that's also it feels kind of personal, and the ability of China to actually have influence is going to be limited based on how citizens in African countries think about China and its trust of China. I think, just to bring it finally back to vaccines, in my own WhatsApp chat groups with folks in Malawi, people are hesitant to get a Sinovac vaccine. They're like, I don't know, when that Chinese vaccine gets here, I'm not sure I'm going to take it, but I'll take this AstraZeneca one. And part of that is if you look at Afrobarometer data, right, this Pan-African research network that conducts public attitude surveys across the continent since 1999, if you look at Afrobarometer data from round 4, there's a question that asks, what is the thing that makes China's reputation negative? And the overwhelmingly plurality response that people give is the quality of Chinese goods. And that is going to carry over. If that is your belief about the product, that's going to carry over into vaccines. And vaccines are already a scary thing to do, right? For the record, I've gotten 2 of mine. I feel grateful to live in a place to get them. But I want to recognize that, putting a needle in your arm with a thing that hasn't been around for a long time, that takes a little bit of courage. And how much you trust you know, how much you trust the people who are giving you that vaccine or where that vaccine comes from is going to matter. And so China's ability to really use this, you know, this great news that they're going to be donating and selling at fair market prices vaccines, I think is huge. It's unclear to me how much credit they're going to be able to claim from it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kim. Let's just roll straight over on to our next presenter, who is Joshua.
Thank you very much. Thanks to my fellow panelists and you know, to OCAN for having me. Look, by way of just letting you guys know, I'm not an Africanist and I'm not an expert in global health. I'm a guy who studies Chinese politics and the Communist Party of China. So that's the perspective I'm going to take on this thing. And so if you're interested in other things, I'm going to defer on all that. And I'm just going to tell you about what I think China is about. And you guys can, you know, tell me what you think. So let me go ahead and share this screen and let's get to it. So let me see. I got to do the slideshow on this, right? So play from start. Here we go. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see that, Nicholas? Oh, great. Okay, so you know, today I'm going to talk to you guys about the Africa-focused propaganda work and take a geostrategic perspective of it. Now, the reason I'm not calling this soft power is because it's not soft power. Soft power is something generated from below, from the people of a particular society, like it's music or it's anime. But what we're talking about here is something generated very much from above, from the Communist Party of China, and is intentional. Next slide. So when we talk about China's geostrategic objectives towards the developing world, of which I include Africa as a part, and this is something Eric Higginbotham and I wrote about in the China Review in an article we wrote about a year ago, we can talk about China's particular objectives here. The first is shaping global norms and institutions in ways that achieve Beijing's core interests. And this primary core interest is to continue to rule China. It is a political organization, the Communist Party of China. Its primary aim is political, and that means controlling China. But it also seeks to maintain and defend the sovereignty of the territory that it claims is China. That includes the South China Sea, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, Taiwan, certain areas around the Indian border, Bhutan, certain areas there. So this is also essential. And then promoting a stable international environment that's conducive for China's continued growth, expansion, economically and politically. However, and this is why the American flag lurks behind here, is constraining US unilateral behavior is really an essential part of what it's doing. And this includes two particular elements I'll get into in a moment, both of which pertain to Africa, although the latter more directly. The first is called multipolarity, and this is an idea that Chinese strategic theorists have talked quite a bit about. And the second is called the democratization of international relations. Now, this map here is illustrative only. Forget about the numbers. What it tells us, though, what it gives us is a sense of the fact that China is trying to spread power throughout the international system. It doesn't want the US to be a kind of unipolar hyperpower. Instead, it wishes to embolden or enhance the power of other actors within the world, particularly those that are friendly to it. So some of these actors are less friendly. So China doesn't really seek to enhance Japan's power, for instance. However, it does work closely with Russia, with South Africa, and Brazil, India to some degree, although that relationship is tense. And the goal is to then create a flatter balance of power throughout the international system, such that the US cannot become this hyperpower that does as it chooses. The second strategy is what they call the democratization of international relations. And again, I want to stress these, books, many books in China are written about these things. I'm giving you the short and dirty on these things, but just to give you a sense of it, it's a Gulliver strategy, whereas smaller developing countries of the world would then constrain through their normative power, the UN and other venues, US unilateral behavior, such that you wouldn't have a coalition of the willing to go into Iraq because nobody would be willing. And so through this normative power, then you constrain US unilateral behavior. And in doing so, though, you don't necessarily say to all of the folks you're working with that this is an anti-US strategy, but yet all along the kind of theme of the relationship is that, we're going to constrain Western power, particularly the United States. Now, this is done through what I call the interlocking lattice work of China-Africa relations. And this is built on something that a guy named He Yafei, the former assistant foreign minister of China, put forward. But as you can see here, I've tried to illustrate China's relations with Africa on the global level, the regional level within Africa, the sub-regional level, which is very unique to Africa. I don't believe China has sub-regional relations with any other developing region of the world, although it does have regional relationships with every other developing region of the world, including Latin America, the Middle East and Arab countries, Central Asia, ASEAN, etc. So regional is very common, but sub-regional has actually been quite unique to Africa. And then on the bilateral level, which China considers its foundational level of relations, you can see a variety of different types of relations that China engages: the state to state, the party to party, mill to mill, and the that I'll do now. Lurking behind all this, it's so important for us to understand the asymmetry of this relationship. Whenever considering questions of agency, one must consider questions of relative power. This gives you a just one-line explanation here. If you look as late as the early 90s, the majority of African countries had a per capita GDP above China's. Today, you're looking at below 5. Below 5 African countries have per capita GDP above China, which means essentially 50 do not. And this gives you a sense, and how rapidly this line has declined, gives you a sense, and how stable it was before, gives you a sense of how rapid this asymmetry has occurred within these relationships. Now, how does China alleviate this? Well, it does so when it conducts negotiations under circumstances that are characterized by friendly relationships and cooperative motivational orientations. These conditions predominate over the power structure and produce results under symmetry and asymmetry. So this then speaks to the point, the excellent point Emmanuel made a moment ago about the question of friendship and partnership and collaboration, and why African leaders look to working with China, because ultimately China projects a friendly relationship and puts its money where its mouth is in terms of hosting African leaders and doing so at their level. Now, African-focused propaganda is the term that the Chinese Communist Party uses, right? The soft power as a notion is new to China. It's kind of been picked up and grafted on to what the Chinese call 对非宣传, which is the Africa-focused propaganda, and this is part of 对外宣传, which is foreign-focused propaganda work. And under Africa-focused propaganda work, there are several subheadings we can acknowledge here. The first is, well, I mean, you don't have to list them in any particular order. All are equally relevant to some degree, I suppose. But you have educational propaganda work, which includes hosting African students, training of African students. You have media-focused propaganda work. You have a lot of hiring of African journalists on the continent. You have training sessions. Here you have the image of the 4th Forum on China-Africa Media Cooperation. You have cultural propaganda work. And this just happens to be the women's celebration. But there are many other cultural relationships you have, exchanges in terms of literature, cinema, all types of cultural exchanges going on, and all of them under the leadership of the Communist Party of China. And then finally, the topic of today, we have Africa-focused health propaganda work. And here you see a bunch of African folks, I'm not really sure what country, and in Chinese, it's very clear. The Chinese government medical supplies, and you see the Chinese flag there affixed to the supplies. So in terms of the way that China views its health diplomacy, and what we call health diplomacy, is as part of its larger structure of propaganda work that it engages in Africa. And Chinese doctors have been prevalent on the African continent since the 60s. So this isn't new. What's new, I suppose, is the scale of it and the level of attention it's getting. But just to understand how rapidly these things have grown. Now, you might say, hey, Josh, well, what about after 2018? After 2018, we have no data. The Chinese government is not releasing data. But just to give you a sense of the rapid growth over the last decade of the amount of students studying in China and their percentage as a number of total foreign students, right? This not only shows that China's hosting more African students, but they're becoming a larger part of the amount of students that are being hosted. So we can see the growing increase in education, Africa-focused education propaganda. Excuse me. Here we can see the kind of the newest that I could find in terms of the vaccine distribution that other colleagues have been talking about. And you can see the robust list of African countries. But again, it's going throughout the developing world. So China sees Africa as part of its major country engagement with developing countries around the world. Africa is a central node in that, but it's not the only one. And so as you can see, and this is from CGTN, the Chinese state provider, the way that the Chinese state provider puts out this information is in terms of a global perspective. And you can see how well represented African countries are there in terms of China's health diplomacy. And so a final summary then here, I can't even exactly see the top of the slide. Move that. So China's main objectives are defending its core interests and constraining US unilateral behavior. It doesn't talk much about the latter, but that doesn't mean it's not important. And we can see this in Chinese strategic writings about this central contradiction being the US. To achieve this, China uses a two-pronged approach, one of multipolarity, less important for Africa, although South Africa is considered a node in the BRICS framework that it's adopted. And then the democratization of international relations, where essentially working with many developing countries, China is able to constrain US unilateral behavior. And then one of the ways that this takes place on the bilateral level, and it takes place on many levels, Emmanuel mentioned the African Union level, but on the bilateral level, I just want to mention the educational exchanges and training, the media exchanges and training, the cultural exchanges, and the health diplomacy in large S. And so the kind of upshot is here, when we look at what China wants in the developing world, and in Africa in particular, what it wants is to build its relational power in Africa, and it wants Africans to validate its domestic political system, and if possible, when possible, adopt certain modalities that reflect well upon it. So let me go ahead and stop sharing there, and happy to take any questions from folks.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ashwa. That was really, really comprehensive in a very short period of time. So let's move on to Gordon, who is our penultimate presenter.
Thanks, Simukai. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's already such a rich and multifaceted discussion, and so I hope only to add to it. So let me just maybe start by situating myself, because we're meeting in a virtual environment. So I'm sitting in the middle of the Texas Medical Center, the largest medical complex in the world. I'm also in Houston, which one of the leading industries is oil and gas. And so as Joshua mentioned earlier, I don't consider health to be a form of soft power anymore, at least. Traditionally oil and gas and military have been discussed as hard power, whereas health and education is soft power. So I hope that with the pandemic, that changes, the categorization at least a bit. And the third is that, this is a city that's also very diverse, arguably the most in America. So I really had a chance, in starting here, learning about, the diaspora's perception of, their home countries, the changing relations with US and with China. We have the biggest Nigerian population here in Houston. So, that's been very enlightening for me. I couldn't travel, obviously, during the pandemic. And so, this is the way in which I kind of pivoted and keep my views globally alive. Okay, so with all that said, I think what I bring to the table today, and this is something I disclosed to Harry when he invited me, is that what I can contribute today is really the US-China health cooperation agenda. Along with two colleagues who are with us today, I can see their names, Yubia Tran and Zoe Liang, of the Bush-China Foundation. We had conducted a Delphi study in late fall of last year, from September to December 2020. So at least we have original data. We surveyed not a large sample, 9 experts, both on the US and China side, but that are just really foremost folks working in health, different aspects of health, and asked them really simply through this exercise of 3 rounds of surveys and 2 interim group meetings, what are the health priorities for US and China, and then US-China for a third country, US and China for multilateral organizations such as the WHO, someone had mentioned PEPFAR, UNH, so on and so forth, okay? And this is what they came back with. The 3 leading topics are pandemic control, long-term care and aging, and the third being clinical trials and data sharing. So just go briefly, like, my reaction on each of these top issue areas. On pandemic control, which is what, the concept node and what we're mostly talking about today is vaccine diplomacy. But from where I stand in the School of Public Health, the bottom line is herd immunity. So you can talk about the crude number of vaccines that are donated, but is it helping the country get to herd immunity, right? And this is in full admission too, that in the US and in China, they're not yet at herd immunity either, unlike Israel and UAE. So let's take into consideration the denominator when we're talking about, how much the donation is just topping up the numerator, okay? Okay, so that's one. And two is, in pandemic control, in thinking about past, present, and future in terms of pandemic control, which was in the concept node, is, one area where it's been very controversial is the investigation of the origin of SARS-CoV-2. And this is where I think the tone from the two WHO missions, however you want to interpret the reports, and I really would implore you to read it in full, is there needs to be as a scientific inquiry ongoing sort of research done, okay, into verifying the different hypotheses that are put forward on the Chinese side, on the US side, and so on and so forth, okay? And I can kind of drill down to that during the discussion, but I'll just say that that those investigation merits ongoing scientific studies, okay? The long-term care aging, I'll skip over, though I'm happy to elaborate on. The third is clinical trials and data sharing. I think that brings up three different issues, right? On R&D investment, on regulatory approval, on like whether it's in Europe, US FDA, Chinese FDA, and the third being the ethics, in the review of multi-center, multi-regional clinical trials, and also on whether these studies can be replicated. Yes, it's important that maybe a paper like appears in the Lancet, but what's really to be questioned also is the consideration of these various regulatory bodies and whether it ensures safety and efficacy. Okay, that's the bottom line in pushing out a vaccine, right? I don't think anyone would disagree with me on that. Okay, so with these three issues in mind, my esteemed panelists have already talked about the various mechanisms through which we can string together the various countries, bilateral, trilateral, multilateral. And so I won't really touch on that. But I want to sort of conclude with three takeaways. So, one is alignment, which I spend a lot of time thinking about. This is not just like within the US or within any country, the decentralization in response to the pandemic, but it's about thinking about China not as a monolith. If you look at the literature on Chinese medical teams, we're talking from a province of China to an African country. And that channel, I think it's still open, right? And so I think it's Joshua had pointed out to you that framework, it crosses like for us as researchers levels of analysis, okay? And then the third, which hasn't been mentioned yet, is unlike China, in the US and in a lot of like African countries, like the writing's not on the wall. For China, if you read Made in China 2025, Healthy China 2030, the most recent white paper on South-South cooperation, these are writings on the wall. And I think figuring out for the Chinese, figuring out the means to attain these goals that are stated, I think that, and of course the 5-year plan, of course I should mention that, right? That's what's noteworthy, I think, in paying attention to the Chinese response. The second takeaway is information asymmetry. If the tone is competition, there is quite simply information asymmetry in what we know about China, what we know about like various African countries' responses. Therefore, it makes this entire conversation an imperfect competition that we're actually talking about here. So, from personal experiences, I spent a year in Beijing and then I spent a subsequent year in Addis Ababa, and that's where Harry and I met. And, I think it's very textured, right? The authoritarian responses. I'm not talking about authoritarian in a negative light. I think it's a different logic that it follows, okay? And so in the comparative literature, it doesn't, I think democracy, authoritarianism, great. What about authoritarianism, right? For example. So, and that also factors into the information asymmetry kind of takeaway. And the third is just about institutional change. let's talk about, African CDC and how much it's grown, like during the pandemic, and the network of laboratory responses, for example. Is there a story there around diffusion and innovation across the continent in future pandemic response? The second is with Chinese institutions. Like, if you pay attention to certain institutions, I had mentioned the Chinese FDA, they dropped food from its name in 2013. If you pay attention to the National Health Commission, which is the most current, institution as a Ministry of Health, they dropped family planning from the name in 2018. And it's not just a name change, it's also restructuring that's continually happening. And then last on institutional change is the CIDCA, the Chinese International Development Agency, that was founded as of 2018. It's a relatively young agency. And so what is it doing in comparison to USAID, who has a new head in place, Samantha Powers, right? So I think these are, from a comparison standpoint, to look at institutional change in and of itself is interesting because I'm an organization theorist by training. I think about organizations, I think about what's happening within them. And I think there's a lot to be said about, whether these are filters for macro changes that, my other panelists have already commented on. So thanks. I will type out my response to the Q&A box and happy to chat further. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Gordon. That was really excellent. Okay, so we'll move on to the last of our speakers' presentation. We have Mandisa Mbali joining us from South Africa.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Very good. Okay, right. I'll try and stick to time. There's a lot to discuss. So what I wanted to talk about today is popular politics, health activism, and vaccine diplomacy in South Africa. And I'd like to preface my presentation by saying that my thoughts are very preliminary. And I suppose what I wanted to pose is really a set of questions or offer a set of hypotheses rather than offer sort of final certain answers. So what I've researched for a long time and written on at some length are the ways in which South African AIDS activists shaped global health politics from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. And what I want to focus my talk today on are two different issues in relation to South African domestic politics, international relations, and COVID-19, which arise in terms of parallels with the historical narrative I focused on in my research. So firstly, I want to focus on the politics of drug regulation. This has always been at the center of HIV treatment activism, starting with when ACT UP in the United States demanded that the FDA successfully expedite access to experimental HIV treatments for people with HIV via clinical trials in the late 1980s. Political pressure to speed up drug regulatory approval has not, however, always been positive. Again, with reference to the history of AIDS, this time in South Africa, we can recount the history of Viridine. In this scandal, this was in the late 90s, the Mandela administration, then largely run by Thabo Mbeki on a day-to-day basis, tried to unduly politically pressure the Medicines Control Council, our version of the FDA, to approve a so-called miracle cure called Viridine. And it turned out that this consisted of, it was basically an industrial solvent that had not been tested in phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials. And the Medicines Control Council was placed under political pressure by the Mbeki administration to approve this dangerous drug that was untested. Fast forward to today, some physicians and lobby groups support an untested, mostly veterinarian-used drug called ivermectin, which is used to treat parasitic infections, which has led to the NCC's successor organization, the South African Health Products Regulatory Agency, hereafter I'll refer to it as SAHPRA, to be the subject of profound political pressure to allow doctors to prescribe the medication against COVID-19. Now, SAHPRA decided not to approve the drug for prevention or treatment of COVID-19. Later, there was a court judgment obtained by the lobby group AfriForum and a group of doctors to allow for its compassionate use simultaneously with doctors applying for particular permission to use the drug in a so-called unorthodox fashion. Why should this matter to those of us interested in vaccine diplomacy? Here, the Chinese developed Sinopharm and Russian developed Sputnik V vaccines enter the story. The South African government has reportedly ordered 10 million doses of each on the expectation that SAHPRA, our regulatory agency, will approve both. In the interest of time, as regards Sinopharm, what we could note is although the WHO has very recently approved it based on data from a large multi-country clinical trial, it's not yet been tested in a large phase 3 clinical trial in South Africa. And while it has been reported that a lab study showed that Sinopharm's vaccine remains active against the so-called South African variant with a reduced effect, we have experience whereby with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, of which there was a large phase 3 clinical trial in this country, this clinical trial found that it only had a 10.4% efficacy against mild to moderate infection with the variant that is dominant in this country, the so-called South African variant. The country had already purchased 1.5 million vaccines and was raring to go with beginning its vaccination program in February, when the South African government halted it on the advice of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID following the findings of the Astra study in South Africa. The doses were then sold on to the African Union, and the government is now rolling out the J&J and Pfizer vaccines. Our variant is wily, and given our resource constraints, there are pitfalls to us rolling out vaccines if our scientists are uncertain that they'll work against our variant. We also have to add into the mix that our country's ruling African National Congress is part of the so-called tripartite alliance with the South African Communist Party, or SACP, and COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, or COSATU. Now, the SACP has been very vocal about the need to purchase the Sinopharm and Sputnik V vaccines, even before they were granted regulatory approval, and it's unclear that this has been driven by science. Perhaps it may be on the part of SACP linked to an ideological concern on us being overly reliant on the so-called West to deliver our vaccines. What I want to say also is that the Sinopharm phase 3 clinical trial results have not, to the best of my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, been published in a high impact international peer-reviewed journal. So similarly, neither stringent regulatory authorities such as the European Medicines Agency or the FDA approved the Sinopharm vaccine. So in terms of this, is there hypothetical risk of political pressure being applied to our independent drug regulatory authority to approve a vaccine produced by a geopolitical ally before our regulatory authority is ready to do so from a data-driven scientific point of view? I'm not fully familiar with the state of play at SAHPRA. I'm merely raising a hypothetical issue. There were a lot of things I could say on IP, but I'm actually basically going to skip all of those. And I want to specifically, for a few minutes, if I may, Simukai, talk about some strategic barriers to effective organising for global health justice in relation to COVID-19 organising. So first up front, I wanted to say that purchase, delivery and distribution of vaccines and health products can be mired in corruption and maladministration. This means there has to be consistent oversight by civil society, the press, the judiciary, and various other important institutions in African democracies. So there needs to be consistent, disciplined, diligent activity across the whole of South African and global society to ensure universal vaccination. And I want to mention some wonderful existing organizations campaigning for health justice in relation to universal access to COVID-19, specifically the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition, the People's Vaccine, including Section 27, the People's Health Movement, MSF, and so on and so forth. And there are two strategic barriers I want to quickly point to effective strategic civil society activism around universal access to the vaccine in South Africa. What we saw with reference to the Treatment Action Campaign as global allies is that two particular types of in-person organising were particularly important. So TAC, to push through global health change to ensure universal access to ARVs, held in-person meetings and workshops with people living with and affected by HIV to explain the science around HIV testing and treatment. And I think we're going to need this in our context because, locally understood metaphors and media have to be used. It has to be in local languages. And I think that building trust has to involve in-person meetings. And secondly, street-based activism is required. There have to be bodies on the street. There's powers in numbers. And people need to be physically present to show their commitment to a cause. And I think we recently saw this with Black Lives Matter. And at the moment in South Africa, in-person organising may only be safe with several restrictions and between waves of the virus. So the in-person organising that has been done, my sense is that it's been quite sporadic and very difficult to maintain, particularly because the final point I want to make is there's limited access to consistent, broadband, reliable internet access by many of South Africa's peoples. So for example, like this webinar, a lot of South Africans would not be in a position to attend this webinar. So there's many other things I could say, but I just wanted to talk about, sort of how South African AIDS activism, how lessons from the AIDS activism, how they might inform emerging African civil society activism around universal access to COVID vaccines. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So we've had just a really incredible sweep of presentations here that cover an array of different angles on health competition, thinking about the changing dynamics of multilateralism, and I think in particular this kind of the tension and iterations of the United States and China and the strategies for constraining each other. And then I think finishing with Mandisa, your talk and the bottom-up perspective on the role of different kinds of non-state action, but run from civil society. Then of course, there's the role of the private sector and how that structures everything from intellectual property to vaccine distribution. I guess one question, one sort of actor that hasn't really been mentioned, and I'd be curious to get a perspective from someone on the panel before we open up to our audience here, is what about the kind of, I guess, the philanthropists of global health? I mean, we've had a bit of reference to COVAX, but I wonder if there's more to be said. Gates, obviously, as the most prominent figure, and judging from Kim's laughter here, the recent rupture in the Gates Foundation may well play into this story. I don't know, but I'm just kind of curious to know how I guess part of the debate that's happening with COVID in general is whether the era of global health is coming to some kind of crossroads, given the difficulties that have existed around coordinating any kind of meaningful global response, that it feels a bit like there's a bit of lip service to the notion of global health as existed and kind of reached, I guess, its apotheosis in the early part of the 21st century. So I wonder if anybody wants to kind of take on that line of argument about where philanthrocapitalism within global health fits into the kind of geopolitics of health competition.
I can take a start. And I was thinking about this actually when Emmanuel was talking, because he had mentioned the Jack Ma Foundation in his remarks. And I was thinking about, if we think about this from the great powers perspective, right? Like, to what extent are African political leaders, but also African citizens, seeing the Jack Ma Foundation as merely an extension of China, right? Just like they might see the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as extensions of the US, right? Which in the case of the US, that's not really, I mean, there has been a lot of goodwill towards the Gates Foundation for, I mean, there's so many people on Twitter, at least, that whenever I say anything bad about Bill Gates, they're in my mentions about how many lives he's saved, right? And, not to bring up Schadenfreude, but I do want to talk a little bit about, Bill Gates's original comments about the vaccine and whether it should be available in certain places. I think that actually harmed his foundation's reputation. In the parts of the world, as Emmanuel mentioned, right, only at most 2% of Africans have been offered the vaccine, and so like to say that that's not the path we should be taking. I think that there's something really concerning about philanthrocapitalism. Who elected Bill Gates or Jack Ma to be able to make these decisions on behalf of not just a single country, right, but many countries, and not just so the kinds of influence and power that they have, I think, and the true lack of accountability for making mistakes, right? What do they learn? Do they learn? Do they have to learn? This is the problem with philanthrocapitalism, right? Is there's no accountability mechanism, right? When all of your resources are in your money, right, and nothing can take your money away, it's really difficult. And I think it's not just difficult for the intended beneficiaries of these philanthrocapitalist programs, but it's actually problematic for the states from which these philanthrocapitalists come and are thus associated with.
Okay. So we've had a few questions come up from the audience that that we can raise. So Paul Cadet has asked, and this is to the panel, that Xi Jinping speaks about mutual, sustainable, and self-sufficient development in Africa. But as Emmanuel pointed out, is the impact of Chinese aid in practice actually promoting sustainable, self-sufficient development? Gordon, you had indicated that you might answer this live. So I wonder if we could start with you in a direct response to that, and then maybe Emmanuel could follow up.
Sure. I can see that Paul, who posed the question, is not happy with my response that's typed. So I'll just say that up front. I'm not a sounding horse for the Chinese government whatsoever. I mean, I'm just citing the text. So let me just be really clear about how the principles that's stated is actually worth paying attention to, right? Because it's how it's interpreted on the ground as well. You asked about impact, and I think Simukai and others, can join in here. And impact on health aid is extremely difficult to measure. A lot of if you look at the World Bank, evaluation documents, a lot of like NGOs aid evaluation documents, they tend to have indicators that are process indicators. How many doses of vaccines did we distribute? How many books did we distribute, right? I mean, is it actually getting you to the long-term measure of like health status improvement and socioeconomic mobility? Not that many actually has those like performance metrics. So, I think it's the answer to Paul's question here is, I think all donors really should hold themselves to these outcome measures as well as the process measures. That's a long and short of it. And I think until you review all the evidence, it's really hard to say what is holistically the Chinese health aid impact, what is holistically the U.S. health aid impact, so on and so forth. Okay. Simukai, I don't know if that answers your question, but I just looked at Paul's, and that's why that was fresh in my mind.
No, that's great. Thank you. Emmanuel, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in, but I will say that there's a kind of addendum to Paul's question, which was that he's asked you specifically that China's health aid has commonly been bilateral. For how long has China's health aid in Africa now been multilateral?
Yeah, I still think Gordon answered did well to answer that part of the question too, and so I don't have too much to add. The only thing I'll add maybe to the first question that Gordon just also answered as well, in terms of the part on self-sufficient development, I think this is an interesting question, and I think this is a question that a lot of African governments, African Union itself, as it's going through reform right now, is also engaging with this question on what is self-sustainable and what is and how it, and this question of African ownership, right? And I think that this is something I still even struggle with analyzing, right? So if I talk to civil society organizations on the continent, particularly West Africa, that's my main area of, and then at the AU, but I talk to some civil society organizations there, right? The ones that interface with the intergovernmental regional organizations are also talking about sort of divorcing from reliance on aid, but they also are quick to say, we need the aid, right? Like, and it's not even in a way that, they're beholden to what, say, China wants to do or USA wants to do or what have you. It's that, as we've talked about before, it's a tool for them strategically to get what they need to actually do the things that they need to achieve the measurables, right? So I think that's a question, that is going to be, if we're going to look at, Simukai, your question of where is global health going, right? And are we going to move away from sort of this lip service piece as it becomes, and I would argue, and I'm arguing this in some work that I'm working now, that as global health has been, used to go towards more high politics, that it will, that there's a possibility, at least in some places on the continent, where it becomes a less of a lip service thing, but there is aid, that the aid is actually more instrumental, more tied to politics in the sort of material way that we think about in international relations. So that's maybe sort of a circuitous answer to say that I think that self-development is in self-sufficiency is a question on the minds of African leaders, and that but it's also and part of that self-sufficiency is sort of elevating global health is not sort of this this passive philanthropic moral thing, but also as part and parcel of politics, high politics in the way that we think about it. So that's how I would respond to it.
Great, thank you. Mandisa, I noticed you have your hand up. Did you also want to give a response here? Oh, you're muted.
Hi, Paul. Good to see you again. So basically, I wanted to say that for me, as someone that's interested in the history of public health, I think the concept of health empowerment and patients taking your health into their own hands and community ownership of health projects is very important. And that doesn't always need money. I don't think money is necessarily the most important thing in catalyzing social change. I mean, what can actually happen is in civil society, there can be a grassroots movement or community organization whereby they're making a lot of people engage in behavior change, or they're doing lobby and advocacy for policy change, but they don't have that much money. And then suddenly you can find the money pours in because they're being effective. And then there's actually divisions within the community because there's a contestation over resources. People become office-based activists who are just seen to be disconnected from the community. So I think that in terms of sustainable change and in terms of public health, I don't necessarily think money is the most important thing. Actually, there's no such thing as a free gift, and it can create more problems.
Mandisa, just while you are, while we've got you, I wondered if you wanted to make any comments on the question we had from Joshua Nederhood on PEPFAR, who has asked about whether the United States can learn from its previous experience with PEPFAR. Specifically, can it leverage infrastructure, organizational techniques, or goodwill generated through PEPFAR, or are there mistakes that it made while dealing with the AIDS crisis that it should avoid with COVID-19? I know obviously you spent a lot of time thinking about AIDS and also from the bottom up. So if you could say something this, and then maybe we can get perspectives from others on the panel too.
I can't discuss this in too much detail, but I feel that the age in global health of trying to get people doing programs on different diseases in competition with each other, rather than please to pay for poor. And then also the idea of the disease at the moment. So there's an idea now that AIDS isn't so-called fashionable anymore. and that COVID is now so-called fashionable. In actual fact, I agree with you that the infrastructure that has been built up should be used, and the human resource infrastructure, to also tackle COVID. And that's actually, in fact, happening, as Emmanuel pointed out in his recent co-authored paper, which I read this very morning. But with PEPFAR, some of the critiques are quite aid specific, based on the different mode of transmission, the sexual mode of transmission, I mean. So the critique around the promotion of abstinence only, HIV prevention policies, for instance, that doesn't apply to COVID. And this is also an important point, that COVID-related stigma and discrimination has a very different feel to it compared to AIDS-related stigma and discrimination, just because the diseases have different patterns of transmission.
Great.
Simukai, sorry, can I just add to what Mandisa said? And Mandisa, I really, like your comments. What I would just reverberate is that, one of the in vogue topics in global health is decolonizing, aid. And, first of all, I think we can use aid/South-South cooperation. And again, maybe it's just terminology, maybe there's more, meaning to those various different terms. The other two is that decolonization is still really not, fully in practice. Like Mandisa had, reminded us that we're meeting in a time zone that may not be very friendly to the continent. But also, I think in terms of scientific publications, like how many recent global health articles do you see have African counterparts in first, second senior author positions, especially? What are the trials and studies that are being done there? Is that promoting reflexivity, right? And that's just in the scientific research realm, let alone, the PEPFAR experience, where it's very Western aid driven. So I hope, these conversations keep going.
So I have two questions about China that I'd like to put to Joshua in the first instance. The first is from Awaz Akhtar. I think Jordan's already made a stab at this. I wonder if you had any thoughts, which is, Awaz asks that, the CDC used to be the US's main provider of practical and technical assistance. And I think there's been a flurry. Michael Lewis has just had a book come out kind of questioning the ability of the CDC to take leadership in COVID-19, showing how it's failed. So the question is, does China have a similar kind of infrastructure for the hard knowledge sharing of this kind? Is it going to be in the game of supporting, dissemination of data and information, epidemiologically speaking, and making connections with local public health officials? And then another part of my question on China, which comes from Harry, is does the Communist Party's own track record, does it see its own health track record and deep inequalities inside China reflect in any way for its strategies of health engagement in Africa? So Josh, if you could have a stab at those.
Well, thank you. Thanks for those questions. So of course, you've got people on here much more knowledgeable than me about the CDC and its failure. So I'm gonna, definitely I'll let them answer that. In terms of China and sharing, this has been a major question and an issue. What is China sharing? What is China not sharing? A lot of the political criticism in Washington surrounds the fact that China did not share enough early enough. And, a lot of this actually will probably go back to something that nobody on this call knows the answer to, which is the actual source of COVID-19. And if the source of COVID-19 is something directly related to the legitimacy of the Communist Party, they are not going to share that information at any point for any reason. If this lab theory, and I am not the one to determine if it's true or not, but if it were to be true, we will never know it from anything they ever give us, okay? Now, so we should accept that, right? We shouldn't go there, show up, poke around, and think we're gonna get that answer, man. That's an answer you're not going to get. And if you think you're gonna get it, then you're kind of lost to begin with. So what we have to understand is the limitations of the political system that they are in. And that means that the party's interests are always going to come first. The legitimacy of the regime is going to come first. And then whatever knowledge they can provide under that umbrella is going to be provided. Any knowledge or information that would undermine that is not going to be provided for any reason, no matter how many pleases and thank yous, and no matter how many people you know in China and how good you think they are your friends, okay? So we have to go in understanding our own limitations, but not, of course, understanding the true sources of the pandemic. So this means we don't really know how much we don't know. Right? There's a lot of known unknowns, but we don't even know what that is, right? I'm sorry if this is getting a little philosophical here, but we're dealing with an institution which is by definition a secretive institution. The membership of the Communist Party itself is not even a public information. So just go in with that kind of realistic notion. And then in terms of the track record that was just before this, with regard to swine flu, was terrible, right? A lot of covering up, a lot of bad information with regard to the swine flu pandemic, which tore through China's pig population and led to surging pork prices among people just before the pandemic. I mean, we forget this because of the pandemic, but it was a major problem, and a lot of it was kind of covered up, right? So that doesn't suggest that China's got the answers in terms of transparency, and certainly what we've seen with COVID doesn't either. But in terms of what it can share, perhaps with Africa, what China does do really well what China does really well is it is after the fact able to monitor its citizens, to barcode, to make sure that it is able to check, right, who has been vaccinated, who is not, who have they come in contact with, making sure that all of this information is available, having it on cell phones immediately available. The United States, because we're a democracy, a lot of this is just not going to be possible in our country. In many African countries, Malawi, I expect, also may not be possible. But in some countries, places like maybe Zimbabwe, for instance, it might be possible, right, that they could take some of these Chinese technologies and try to implement these health-related strategies. Now, how effective that will be, I'm not the expert to know whether these can actually be implemented in these countries. But there's no doubt in my mind that as China builds out this technology, it's going to try to market it and it's going to try to sell it just as it has done its AI and its other surveillance technologies. So I would expect that your second question, I would expect we're almost definitely going to see some kind of sharing going on between China with regard to its technology and its healthcare surveillance state, along with packaged with its other surveillance tools.
Okay, so I had another question, which is kind of emanates from the comments that we've had so far, and it's about the WHO. So on the one hand, we kind of seem to be agreeing that health can no longer be seen as an arena of soft power. It has entered the high politics of international, of the great powers and international organizations. And on the other hand, even if we were just to look at the 21st century, the track record of the WHO in terms of pandemic prevention, monitoring, response has been very contingent on who has been its director general, and also their ability to apply various kinds, essentially, of soft pressure on other world leaders to try to implement some kind of global health agenda. And then, of course, in the early stages of COVID, the decisions that and the positioning that Tedros has taken as Director General vis-a-vis China, as well as having Trump in power, played into the US-China kind of rivalry and divisions at the moment. So I guess my question is then, what do the panelists think about the future of the WHO? Is this in any way a viable institution within the arena of global health, and particularly given the revived health competition between the great powers, and obviously the increasing salience of global health in politics? Kim.
Great. So as anyone can expect, my answer is going to be, here's a great book to read. Jeremy Yuda has a book on global health governance. I put a link in the chat for folks, where he talks about not just the World Health Organization, but actually philanthrocapitalist organizations like the Gates Foundation and others, and kind of their evolved importance and relevance and power over time. And I think it's through his work, not just in this book, but broadly, that I've learned a lot about the growing constraints that the WHO has faced in their actual inability to do work because of their underfunding. And so it's interesting, like we call it the World Health Organization, right? And we give, whatever deference or respect that comes with that, but we don't give it the money, right? And so, and what leverage do they really have, right? Even as like, what are the sanctions that the WHO can enact on say a big bully on the playground like the United States, who is going to say, we're going to hoard all of these vaccines because we're an individualist, selfish nation. That's what we're going to do, right? And what's the WHO going to say? They're not going to say anything, right? Because eventually they're going to want the U.S. and in particular its manufacturers to provide vaccines to the rest of the world. And so they just kind of have to bite their tongues and bide their time. And it's interesting that you bring up Tedros, and it's hard for me as someone who's been trying to study global health and understand the role of the WHO. It's hard for me to disentangle race and racism from this underfunding of the WHO, right? So, to what extent is a racist president like Donald Trump saying, the U.S. is going to pull its funding from the WHO? To what extent is that because he's like an anti-globalist, or he's just a racist and Tedros is black and from Africa? Like, I can't know which of those things are operating, right? Because, I can't get in the man's head. I don't want to be there anyway. But I think, one of the challenges is the WHO was underfunded before Trump. So Trump is not special, even if he's on the TV. Not as much anymore, but small miracles.
Great. So let's take a comment to that from Joshua and then from Gordon.
That's funny. I think Emmanuel kind of beat me to it a little bit there, but yeah, why I think it's probably a kind of a little column A and B. I mean, as a New Yorker myself, I've seen Donald Trump's racism from the Central Park Five. It's been a part of my life. So I think it's both. But that doesn't mean that the WHO doesn't have its problems, and that doesn't mean that there aren't issues that can be addressed, and that doesn't mean that China has not tried to curry some favor there in ways that could be considered untoward. Now, I think people on this call know better kind of what China has done, but I do believe that there is some concern that is valid here. But again, I don't want to overstate my own knowledge, but I just think that, there is reason to be concerned, but I'm of the camp of fix it, don't nix it. So I guess, that's kind of what I would prefer. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just pick up, off of what Kim and Joshua have said already, which is that the WHO, to use lack of a better metaphor, a Swiss Army knife, they are based in Switzerland. And there's just so many health issues that they're responsible for and have very little money to do. Now, with Trump pulling out of the WHO, the assessed contribution definitely will not be there. And then certainly there will be no more voluntary contributions on top of that, right? But from a disease area where I've worked a lot with WHO on, which is mental health, there are just how many other international governmental organizations have that, would work on advancing that agenda? Not many, right? And so I think while a lot of the attention has been on the pandemic, I would just call attention to, mental health, which by the way, is in the same department as cognitive disorders and substance abuse and suicide, okay? So it's secondarily marginalized compared to other non-communicable diseases in turn to communicable diseases. So I have to add that important footnote in there.
No, it's a really crucial point. Mandisa, please jump in.
Well, I've been thinking the same thing for a number of years at the WHO. In fact, the whole architecture of global health is not fit for purpose. And the thing is, global health used to be something that was done in Africa to Africans. Now, global health is something that concerns the Swiss government. So it's not just, doctors in Geneva that are making programs for Africa. Actually, Swiss doctors themselves are in the jaws of a real crisis with their own patients. But I think that takes us to a deeper point in international law, which is economic, social, and cultural rights, and the way in which they're enshrined in international law. Because the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, even if a country's ratified it, all that happens, an international committee issues a report on how they're doing. So their homework gets marked to some extent, but there's no grades that are offered, or there's no real sanctions. But there's just one other thing I wanted to say, which is I think we've got to tackle the issue of corruption, because in South Africa, we had the whole state capture thing, whereby there was massive theft from our state-owned enterprises, and one of the companies implicated was the Chinese Railway Rolling Stock Corporation, which bribed the Guptas in order to get a massive contract with our state-owned sort of railway company. So I don't think that Chinese company is necessarily squeaky clean. There has to be civil society oversight. Can't be.
Great. Okay, so as we're approaching the end, I'll take comments from Kim and then Gordon, and then if there are no further questions, Nicholas, I'll hand back to you to wrap up.
I'm so grateful that Mandisa brought up corruption, because in the country that I study the most, Malawi, there has been a lot of reporting in local newspapers about corruption around COVID. So ministers being fired because there were millions of dollars stolen from the COVID response, and including one minister misspent $500, immediately replaced it, said he was sorry. Didn't matter. President fired him. And I think what's interesting is that Malawi's gone through a big shift towards democracy this year, and so we're seeing that kind of accountability at the local level. But there was something that Emmanuel was talking about earlier about kind of self-sufficient development, right? And donors. I'm thinking again of this question that was asked by Joshua Netterhood about, what are the lessons learned from PEPFAR? And, one of the things about PEPFAR was it was really big on only spending money on things and not spending money on people. So they would fund all of these supplies, but not pay for the healthcare workers that would actually be necessary in order to get those medical supplies to the people that need them in the way that they're needed, right? Trained personnel. And that's because they wanted people to be self-sufficient, and they want development programs to be sustainable in the long run. And that's just not, I hope that's a lesson learned for PEPFAR. That was bad. That was you can't have equipment and not have people providing those resources. And with the structural adjustment programs and various other austerity programs that happened in the 80s and 90s, there's been this massive retrenchment of civil service and the ability for the civil service to provide these things, and so you kind of need aid to learn from the mistakes of PEPFAR in order to do that now. However, the challenges are when you give African leaders the resources to not just get things but to hire people, you open yourself up to the possibility of these kinds of corruption, like Mandisa was talking about, that had happened in South Africa and that have happened during COVID in Malawi when there was a serious surge. So I think that the only thing the things that are going to work towards making that still possible are, as we're seeing in Malawi, the national government holding people to account when found out to be engaging in these kinds of acts of stealing from the population.
So thank you, Kim. Gordon.
Yeah, thanks. I would not disagree with Kim and with Mandisa. I would, however, question, two things. One is what is the managerial capacity of these various aid funded health programs and projects, whether it's operations, HR, so on, so finance, accounting, so on and so forth. Was it there in the first place? Was it robust enough for us to say, okay, as a result of the health aid that was given, then we can accurately trace every dollar to get it to that impact that we wanted to get, right? And so that's one line of inquiry. Another is that, one really interesting read as I was preparing for this talk last night is Brad Parks and his group at A-Data recently published a report where they, looked at 100 contracts from Chinese lenders, and mostly from CDB, China Development Bank, and the Exim Bank, Export-Import Bank. And I hope there's more work like that. Kim's been really good about sending out, references, but that one you can readily look up online through CGG, because I think that would really get to Mandisa's point about corruption too. Like, what is the lender creditor, what is that relationship look like? What are the transaction costs involved? And, I think we talked a lot about grants, but, really the equal focus on concessional loans, non-concessional loans as the BRIs build out, that is so key, and again, kudos to this group for getting that out.
Oh, great. Kim, do you have a final comment?
Very quick. So sure. I just want to say, thank you, Gordon, for pointing out, like, there were needs for capacity building. I think that's true and fair across not just, I think, the health sector, but in other sectors. One thing I always worry about, though, with us, like, thinking about problems as, is there capacity, aren't there, like, needs for technical support, is that when we focus on technical issues, we lose sight of the fact that some of the problems are political and not technical, and that you can come up with technical solutions, right? Like the IFMIS, which is this, like, international financial management information software that is used, across the continent and elsewhere to try to manage, resources and to do so transparently. It's like, you can have IFMIS and people will still steal. So I think that there are important technical solutions that are needed. They don't solve political problems, however.
Great, thank you. So I just wanted to say, as we come to a close here, that, having been working on global health issues and global health politics for quite a long time, this occasion feels particularly special, just because I think the caliber and range of perspectives that we've had talking about some of the most important shifts in global health kind of happening presently is just amazing. So a real kudos to our panelists, Gordon, Emmanuel, Joshua, Mandisa, and Kim, on just such a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. It really did feel special to me to have the opportunity to chair this discussion. And thank you to all of our audience here for such rich and engaging questions. So I'll hand over to you, Nicholas, for final words.
Thank you, Simukai, and thank you for mentioning your wonderful precedent as convener of OCAN. I left it out at the beginning. Yeah, thanks. So I won't be too long. Thank you, everyone, for such a rich discussion. I think it really was in line with one of the main aims of OCAN, which is forging transdisciplinary discussions, which is essential at this moment in time for China, Africa has always been, but especially at this moment, the global pandemic and all that it involves. So I think this is a very good, rich discussion. This will be available on YouTube afterwards, in case you want to spread the links to other people you know. Yeah, and so yeah, that's it. So let me pass on the word to Harry to give some concluding remarks in the name of OCAN as well.
Well, thanks so much, Nicholas. I'll be extremely brief. Thank you to all the panelists and to Simukai. I think indeed, we had very high hopes for this panel, and I think you've certainly lived up to those high expectations. So thank you so much. It's once again proven indeed that the point that Simukai and I used to discuss, the importance of using health indeed as a lens, and particularly health crises as a lens to understand a whole range of aspects to do with the China-Africa dynamic, whether it's indeed the politics of the Chinese Communist Party, ideas around soft power and messaging and the importance indeed of culture, some of the political economy questions, as well as technical institutional debates. And then of course, very importantly, not just studying the question indeed of how does China impact Africa, but how do African experiences and a variety of African responses also shape China and various actors on that side, and to try to see the relationship as, yes, asymmetrical, but certainly a two-way one, not just a one-way street. And again, thank you so much for your attendance here, for your participation. Thank you once again also to Nicholas for organizing an outstanding conference, including the earlier session. We look forward to seeing you again at some of Wukan's events, and wherever you may find yourself. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, evening, morning, whatever it may be. But thank you so much also on my part.
Be well, everyone.
Thanks, stay safe.
Thanks all.